She is celebrating, and she is preparing his body. The disciples are arguing over the checkbook. Jesus says to them, "No worries," he says. "You will always be able to do the right thing for the poor, because the poor will always be around you." If there ever was a misunderstood text used to justify exactly what it doesn't say, here is one. Jesus is not talking about the inevitability of poverty here, despite what our capitalist preachers say. Jesus is talking about the social location of the church. He is saying, you will always be among the poor. And so whenever you wish, you can do the right thing. But this woman has done the right thing now to me, because she understands what we are about. She understands that I am the true leader, and she understands that that means going the Via Crucis, the way of the cross. She has anointed me as king and prepared me for the way of the cross. Let her be. Leave her alone, is what Jesus said. Well, there might be a lesson here for men who are always trying to control things. Just let her do what she does. There might be a lesson there for a church still patriarchal, for a church that still gets in the way of women who are doing the right thing. Leave her alone. Get out of her way. The objection, of course, that the disciples really have here is that this woman is acting as a disciple. And that always makes men nervous. The tradition tells us in Mark that this story, preserved in all four Gospels, this story should be reiterated whenever the Gospel is preached. And that is an extraordinary commendation. At all times, in all places, wherever, whenever the good news is told, tell this story in memory of her. Mark has taken the Eucharistic words, which don't appear in the Last Supper story in Mark, and replaced it right here. Do this in memory of her. Perhaps because anointing Jesus' body for the way of the cross is not a memorialization of Jesus. It is an act of solidarity with the discipleship of the cross which Jesus forges. Our faith is not about memorializing. It is about following. This woman understands that, and she is commended for that over the objections of the disciples, even the politically correct objections. I have come halfway around the world to tell this story in memory of her, as is right, as we are instructed to do. There are many women who have understood discipleship over the years. Rarely, if ever, has their story been told. It is one of the great scandals of the Christian church and our Christian tradition that we do not tell the story of those who have understood the discipleship way. I would like to tell a second story about another woman who understood discipleship. She is one of your own. She is right here. She is present in this place. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Radcliffe, Libby Radcliffe. Some of those sitting here knew and loved her. This week, it is 6 years since she passed on to the cloud of witnesses. During the 1970s, at the same time that in my country, alternative Christian communities of radical discipleship were springing up, around Australia, communities of radical discipleship were seeded by people like John Hurt and Athol Gill. In Brisbane, the House of Freedom. In Sydney, the House of the New World. And right here in Melbourne, the House of the Gentle Bunyan. Communities with stories that outlast even their own life. In 1972, Libby Radcliffe came to the House of Freedom as a young teenage Christian convert. There she quickly rose into the ranks of leadership because she understood what Jesus is about. Blessed with an extraordinary sense of humor, gifted, sensitive, strong. She helped that community evangelize and work for justice among the marginalized of the city of Brisbane, and a few years later came down to help John and others with the house in Sydney, the House of Freedom, where she again exercised her gifts in leadership, becoming a pillar wise beyond her years, always available and thus always vulnerable to the pain of community and the mission. And soon she also came to Melbourne, originally to take a break from years of hard work, originally to come study theology, but very soon she also was wooed back into leadership at the House of the Gentle Bunyan because she was too good. Among the hundreds of people who went in and out of these communities and other communities like them around Australia, Libby Radcliffe was the only person who offered her life in leadership to all three of the main East Coast urban communities. She was, therefore, a true representative of the tradition of radical discipleship in this country. She understood what it was about. And she poured her life out as the most expensive perfume. She gave it all she had, which is more than one can say about most of us. She held back nothing. She held back nothing. By the time she left the House of the Gentle Bunyan here in Melbourne in 1985 to go work with the Australian Council of Churches, she was coordinating the national hearings on peace and justice that you might remember 10 years ago. She had become an elder in the movement, and she was still only in her late 30s. She had been at it a long time, 20 years. She had the scars to prove it. She was widely beloved, but none of us understood just how much she bore the wounds and the promise of our radical discipleship movement in her own flesh. Well, those days seem long ago. The heady days of radical discipleship communities seem long ago. A lot of people have grown out of it. A lot of folks have burned out or moved on or sold out. Not Libby. She agonized about the cost of discipleship. Perhaps people don't risk radical discipleship. Perhaps they don't risk community because the gospel is too demanding and the world too overwhelming and we too frail.